Okay, so Lonnie Gilroy is the 2023 Tom Brock Scholar. The Tom Brock Bequest Committee, we have an annual lecture looking at rugby league history and a scholarship program that allows academics to further the field of rugby league in academia, which is an under-researched area, in my opinion. So Lonnie's project was very exciting for us because it kind of opens up a whole new field of rugby league research. Lonnie is not only looking at depictions of rugby league on screen, but he is also writing a screenplay that, hopefully that could one day add to depictions of rugby league on screen. But that screenplay comes out of his research. So we were very excited to award Lonnie the 2023 Tom Brock Scholarship. And tonight is a chance to hear all about what his research has taught him. Lonnie is a master's student at the University of Central Queensland. And I think without any further ado, I'll put it over to you, Lonnie.
Thank you so much, Michael. I'll just share my screen to get this up and running. Okay, hoping everyone can see the presentation got here. So, as Michael says, I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the land where I live, which is Brisbane, Meanjin. It's home to the Turrbal and Yagara people. And huge thank you to Michael and the team from Tom Brock Bequest Committee and the Australian Society for Sports History. Really thrilled to be here. Not every night this sort of thing happens. If you attended the ASH conference in Canberra last year, you'll find tonight's webinar very similar to my presentation there. Things haven't changed too much in rugby league cinema in the last 12 months, but I've got a bit more time tonight, so I'll be covering some new ground, so please do stick around. And if you're new, thank you very much for coming along. I hope you take away some new knowledge about rugby league on the silver screen, but also a wider appreciation of the intersection of sport and cinema. So as Michael said, over the last few years, I've been completing a Master of Research online with Central Queensland University. As part of this research, I've been analysing fictional depictions of rugby league in cinema with the screenwriting and genre lens, and writing my own screenplay, which responds, extends, and critiques my research findings. The Venn diagram of rugby league and film academic research isn't very large. You might be looking at it right now, and finding that research gap, I think, is really important when you become a researcher. But I say this to let you know, feel free to disagree with the things I say here, not claiming to be right about everything or the final word on this subject. But I am bringing my perspective after a great deal of research and thinking about the interplay of rugby league and cinema. As Michael said, I was awarded the 2023 Tom Brock Scholarship, and I can't thank the group enough for that. As rugby league fans, we're really lucky to have such an organisation in Australia, and we shouldn't take this for granted. My master's thesis has been examined. It's come back with a few minor changes required, so very close to the end. And this presentation tonight is a really good way to cap it all off. I won't go too far into it, but if you're interested, I also have 2 pop culture podcasts, I Only Like You in Movies, to review new release movies and TV shows, and I Miss You Man, which we look at all sorts of nonsense on that one, but generally it's pop culture related and sometimes rugby league related. I don't generally have a big wider audience, so thought I'd just take a chance to give them a plug while I'm here. Feel free to check them out and get the conversation going. Email, Twitter, however else you want to get in touch. So for the purpose of this webinar, discuss rugby league on film, but I want to start by laying out some contextual information. So firstly, it's always struck me as kind of cool and interesting that the best 2 things in the world, which are rugby league and cinema, both were born in the same year, a few months apart in 2 countries pretty close to each other. So rugby league officially broke away in August 1895, and the Lumiere brothers getting their films up and running in France that same year. It's a bit strange to say born for these developments, but it's kind of cool. They were happening around the same time. It's maybe a coincidence, but it's a cool link for these 2 mediums. We've all seen sports movies, and sometimes the only thing we know about a certain sport is their cinema. I know nothing about ice hockey, for example, but I know the Mighty Ducks. I don't have a real love for boxing, but I do love Rocky and Creed. But I also think it's worth taking a step back to comment on the similarities between these mediums of sport in cinema and storytelling and the arts more generally. First of all, I've got two observations. First one's a bit long on the left there, but it's a funny letter to the editor. It basically says, I'm sick of sports commentators saying that you can't write a script like this when something amazing happens in a game, because writers can write all sorts of fantastical storylines. So a writer crafting a story about a last-minute equalising goal, isn't that impressive? The second one on the right there is a tweet from Brandy Jensen that says, I'm such a sucker for a sports movie. I want the team to win so bad, and it seems like they won't. OMG, they did it. It's essentially a 27-word summary of why we love these movies and why we love sports in general. I spent about 40,000 words on my thesis, but in 27, Brandy has summed it all up. So I think if you think about the similarities between these mediums in terms of storytelling and sport, there's a lot to work with. We've got pageantry in both. We've got jerseys and costumes. There's the theatre or the spectacle, the drama of a sporting game, the characters, the players run out to a crowd and audience. We've got heroes and villains, got booing and cheering. The iconography, look at the gladiators here next to Rocky, not dissimilar. The gladiators look a bit like Bennett like Beckham from the previous slide as well. And then if we go to the discourse, we also have thematic similarities with films and sport. Talk about storylines heading into competitions. There's the jockeying for underdog status. Some players get a Hollywood or a fairy tale ending or have it taken away from them. I'd argue that sports borrow a lot from storytelling, and storytelling find a lot to work with in sports. And once you start thinking about this, I think you'll find it everywhere in your next sporting discussion. As an illustrative example, Shane Warne used to explicitly talk about the hidden guiding hand of a scriptwriter in his career. And if you think about Shane Warne's life and career, he pretty much had every twist and turn, didn't he? I didn't watch the Warnie TV movie from last year, but let us know in the comments later if you think it's any good. Maybe that can be the next webinar. You might be wondering which films we're going to talk about tonight and how they were selected for my research. Truth be told, it's not a whole lot out there, rugby league films. I knew about them, had seen most of them already. But my guiding principle was it's a film that relies upon rugby league as a substantial element, including but not restricted to narrative, character development, setting, and world building. Films that I'm looking at are here, top of your side, This Sporting Life, The First Kangaroos, Up and Under, Footy Legends, The Final Winter, Broke, and Chasing Comets. But also recognise that there are some other films and TV shows out there that have rugby league in more minimal roles as a side character or just in a way that's peripheral to the main plot. For example, there's a Canberra Raiders jersey that popped up in Colin from Accounts, a TV show this year. Not quite hitting that threshold for my purposes, but they're still pretty cool. I get a thrill when I see rugby league mentioned anywhere. Also, there's been some theatre and some documentaries, other TV shows over the years, some TV commercials that are quite dramatic narrative elements to them. But tonight we're talking about movies. So enough pre-game talk. Let's blow the whistle, ref, and get stuck into rugby league on film. I'll take us through each film briefly and then discuss the key findings of the films. We'll talk about the future of footy on film, whether rugby league can be considered a subgenre, and there'll be some time for some questions at the end. I'm going to do the British films first, and then we'll come down under. So the first film I can't say much about because there are no copies that exist and probably no one alive has seen this film. We know the plot though. We follow a guy called Alf Skodja as he unintentionally embarks on a rugby league career with hilarious hijinks ensuing. Tony Collins, as a well-known rugby league historian, has written about this film and says it did not aspire to be a great work of art. Bit harsh, fair. Collins also situates the film in the context of British sports comedies of the 1930s, most of which did quite well. and the film was made to appeal to the North England market where rugby league is from and quite strong. It seems like this film is quite over the top, pretty cliched, and it pretty much flopped at the box office and faded from view. If it didn't involve rugby league, I don't expect anyone would be talking about it. Perhaps the most interesting brush with history, apart from its rugby league connection, is the hurried name change. So it was originally titled Where's George? Pay-per-view side was the new title because shortly after release, George V died, and the film was consequently altered out of respect. Seems like they took those posters down pretty fast. As we go on, I think you'll find tonight that this film is kind of the exception that binds the rest of the rugby league films together. The rest, as we see, will pretty serious affairs with tough, troubled men at the centre. In comparison, the hope of his side seems like it was a pretty breezy, cliched comedy. Things get interesting in This Sporting Life. So this film is to the test of time. It's on many best British film of all time compilation lists. You might question the importance of those lists, but it's an achievement. In my research, I found This Sporting Life to be virtually the only rugby league film that ever rates a mention in any discussion. It's the one that's really broken through in terms of scholarly books and articles. Certainly, it's the only rugby league film so far that has earned Oscar, BAFTA, and Cannes nominations. This Sporting Life was adapted from the novel of the same name by David Storey. Storey played rugby league professionally, mainly in the second division for Leeds while he was studying in art school. And he had a long career as a novelist and playwright. But he drew upon his experiences in rugby league for his first novel, an inspiration path we'll see again. I won't lie, and if you've seen this film, you'll agree it's quite bleak. It's quite gripping as well, though. It's well directed. Richard Harris is doing a bit of a Brando spin, and it works. Frank Marchin is the protagonist that he plays. He's a frustrated and angry coal miner in Northern England. He envies the elevated social status of rugby league players in his local town, decides to trial for a place in the team. And suddenly, a professional rugby league player, Frank is thrust into a world of possibility, one above his former low social ranking. And paradoxically, the more violent he is on the field, the more celebrated he becomes off it. So he's got a lot of resentment and he's got the sorry lot in life. He's actually the model for a rugby league film protagonist, for better or for worse. A lot of this film and the book are centered on a toxic and taboo relationship that Frank finds himself in with his widowed landlady, Mrs. Hammond. Frank wants her, he needs her, but she despises him, and that tears him up. I myself am a bit torn on this film. When watching it, you're really drawn into this deep and dark story. It's very well done, but it's not a very flattering portrait of rugby league or of the men who play it. Some people have called it an anti-rugby league film. That's probably a fair enough conclusion to draw, because playing football doesn't make Frank's life much better. We move on to Up and Under in the 1990s. We're still in England, but for the last time. It's interesting, I think, to chart the creation of these films against rugby league dominance and popularity. So we're starting off in the UK in the mid-20th century, but by the early 2000s, it's only Australia making rugby league films. At this time as well, the NRL in Australia is well on top of the UK in terms of rugby league popularity and dominance on the field. Most pundits would say that Australia started dominating the UK in the 1980s, so it doesn't quite match up, but it's certainly interesting to think about those comparisons. So in Up and Under, we're in that full Monty wheelhouse. We've got Northern battlers taking it to the man. I wrote in my thesis that it's an intermittently enjoyable underdog tale. In this film, we follow Arthur. He's a former professional rugby league player whose career ended prematurely due to on-field violent indiscretions. He's now living a drab life as a tradesman in Hull, but he still harbours a competitive edge. He encounters Reg, an old rival who lords over a local amateur rugby league competition. Unwisely, but rather in keeping with the toxic machismo of rugby league film protagonists, Arthur wagers his home and life savings that he can coach a local team of plotters to beat Reg's reigning champions. So we've got a team of misfits, a put upon protagonists seeking one last shot at glory, and a big game climax, the film isn't pushing the boundaries of the genre. The film's treatment of Hazel, you can see in the poster there, is the female gym owner. She's employed to train the team. The treatment of her is sometimes uncomfortable. She's the most charming character. She's the woman holding her own in a man's world. She has the best lines and confidently undercuts this team's sexist jibes. She's pretty much shown as smarter and cooler than these yobbos. But they also show her like nude in the shower, and she's ogled by the characters constantly. They come around to respect her by the end of it, but the journey there is a bit bumpy. The film also wrings some humour out of its scenario. The conclusion is satisfying. It's difficult to not cheer when the little guy wins. I'll go on to talk more about this, but other rugby league films, they have a bit more to say about the sport, whether rugby league is a positive influence or whether it's dragging people down. I don't feel like Up and Under has much to say about rugby league in that sense. The sport just sort of exists as a means to an end for these characters. So Australia made its first foray into the rugby league film world with the first Kangaroos. This was technically a made-for-TV film, but to save few rugby league films, we're going to count it anyway. This is based on true events. The first Kangaroos, it tells the story of the somewhat troubled but ultimately successful first Australian Kangaroos tour of England in 1908-09. The film focuses on the tour manager J.J. Giltinan and his attempts to make the tour successful. Giltinan is cunning and somewhat mendacious, but a true believer in spreading the gospel of rugby league. The film also details the conflict between aging English star Albert Goldthorpe and up-and-coming Aussie talent Dally Messenger. The film is rugby league's most overt attempt at historical drama or biopic, but its relationship with the truth is a bit complicated. The film admits this by saying, in on-screen text, the events you're about to see actually happened. Well, some of them, sort of. And according to the family members of both Messenger and Goldthorpe, the film's central conflict about these two players hating each other was confected, and the characterization of both men was inaccurate. So the film plays fast and loose with the truth. It's lacking in dramatic stakes, and outside of Giltinan, has uninteresting one-dimensional characters. But it's still a pretty interesting story to tackle as the first Australian rugby league film. So we move forward to 2006, getting to the good stuff now. We've got Footy Legends. Now, this probably employs the most traditional sports movie narrative of Australian rugby league films. It was co-written by Arne Doe and directed by his brother, and the film is inspired by their upbringing as refugees in Sydney with a joint love for rugby league. Arne stars as Luke, a late 20s Vietnamese Australian kind of floundering in the working class Western Sydney suburbs. When child protection authorities threaten to take away his sister, who he's raising, Luke bands together his old high school teammates to enter a local amateur rugby league tournament. The prize winnings including a Lowe's modelling gig and a Holden ute. So Footy Legends hits many of the classic film tropes. We have underdogs, disadvantaged protagonists, a narrative focusing on growth and redemption, and opponents who seem unbeatable. The opponents here being rugby league legends such as Brett Kenny and Cliff Lyons. But as the film goes on, guess who will become the real Footy Legends? The film checks off these cliches with charm and good humour, if perhaps not great depth. In terms of rugby league, the film presents a positive outlook, arguing that the sport brings communities together and can provide young men a platform to demonstrate their best selves. I find this film really delightful. I saw it as a kid and remember it being okay, but nothing amazing. But I've had to revisit a few times for my research, and I'm just delighted by the film's sweetness and how it earns the dramatic moments. It's on Netflix right now. If you haven't seen it, watch it tonight. A bit of a 1-2 punch in 2006, 2007. We get The Final Winter following Footy Legends. This film covers the last week of Mick Grubb Henderson's rugby league career in the early 1980s. This film is fictional, but firmly rooted in true life experiences. So Grubb's nickname is not ironic. He is a hard man, standing in for all the tough warriors who built the game since its beginning. but whose rough and tumble play, including head-high tackles, eye gouging, fighting, was growing out of style in the 1980s and certainly out of favour by the film's release in 2007, well and truly these days. Written by and starring former rugby league player Matt Nable, the film is something of a love letter to these men. It's sympathetic to their plight in the increasingly commercialised sporting arena, which serves to profit off the game they helped create, and indeed profit off their bodies and labour. There's also a Cain and Abel aspect to the story, which I frankly overlooked in my research, but something that Michael and I spoke about when he came on my podcast recently to discuss The Final Winter. The older brother Grub is in the past, his younger brother Trent playing for another team is the future. End of the day, though, blood is thicker than water, that sort of stuff. I tend to agree with the critic Shembri, who said that while the film successfully dramatizes Grub's inner workings and flaws, by concurrently lionizing Grub and his legacy, the film is trying to have it both ways, by simultaneously decrying Grub's thuggish behavior while pining for the bygone era he represents. Broke comes to us about 10 years later as the game goes from strength to strength. Bigger TV deals, higher ratings, million-dollar contracts for players. In contrast to what's happening in the NRL, Broke is a small independent film about rugby league player at rock bottom. I would say the film's title reflects his financial status, but also his soul. Broke follows Ben BK Kelly, who's a homeless, destitute ex-footballer who's taken in by a kindly stranger, Sek, and his older daughter, Terry. They attempt to rehabilitate BK after many years of alcohol and gambling abuse. And while they may be strangers to BK, he is in fact their favourite football player, and for Terry, he was a childhood crush. I'd say that Broke is essentially a social realist film, and it's a reminder that the rising tides of rugby league leave many behind. BK is the latest in a long line of distressed male protagonists in rugby league films. He finds it difficult to communicate, he clearly hates himself, and sees no hope for the future. That said, as the film goes on, some bright spots open up, sometimes despite his best efforts. Broke didn't have a wide release, it mainly stayed in the festival circuit, but those who saw it quite liked it, myself included. I do think that critics are predisposed to enjoy these more deconstructive rugby league films that point out the sport's flaws, the sporting life, for instance, rather than the more optimistic efforts like Footy Legends. Critical reception of film is obviously a very nuanced topic, but that's something I've been noticing here. But overall, with Broke, I think it's a really brave, creative decision to look at one of the most popular sports in a country like Australia, which is obsessed with sport, and decide to make a film that challenges that status quo. And for our last film, we've got Chasing Comets. So after two serious affairs, Rugby League's cinematic output is finished off by another mostly light-hearted affair. Chasing Comets has many subplots which all revolve around a character called Chase Daylight, Wagga Wagga's hottest and I would say best named rugby league prospect. While Chase pursues a professional rugby league contract, he wrestles with personal demons and finds himself inspired to become a better man after reconnecting with his Christian faith. I would say discussion of Chasing Comets can't be divorced from its writer, Jason Stevens. He's a fascinating rugby league cultural figure, Jason Stevens. Probably deserves his own historical presentation at some point. He's a very good player. He played for New South Wales and Australia. But really, I think the first line of his rugby league story is his much publicised decision to abstain from sex before marriage, which was tied to his religious faith. This story was irresistible to the media because footy stars are usually getting on the front page for sex scandals, not taking a vow of celibacy. I would say in a lot of ways it's quite an admirable way to live, but it's also a stance that is at odds with much of the sexual attitudes of mainstream society. This film isn't too bad, but it sort of slumps when it hews too closely to Stevens' career and the NRL more broadly. We've got these real-life inspirations awkwardly transposed to a regional sporting competition. Like, who really cares that much if a player in a local comp in Wagga Wagga is abstaining from sex? It might be a story, but it doesn't really work on the national scale like the NRL. Also think, no offense to the actors, but I think the main actor is a touch too old to play an up-and-coming star. I might be nitpicking here, but the humor doesn't land and a lot of the storylines fizzle out. The film didn't do too well critically or box office. It's probably fair enough, but I think it's a really fascinating cultural artifact. Again, we've got a former rugby league player offering his version of events. And this film is trying to toe the line between a blokey bloke comedy and, as it turns out, a religious message movie. Maybe not really succeeding, but interesting to watch. Now, with the films outlined, I'll briefly discuss my key findings from the research. So, rugby league films are concerned with troubled men playing a violent sport. The films are either worried or silent about the impact of this violence. The men playing rugby league are working class battlers. They're failing elsewhere in life, but using sport, they can redeem past mistakes or prove their worth. Winning on the field is cleansing. Victory washes away all sins. By and large, female characters are relegated to supporting roles. They're the wives, the mothers, the romantic pursuits. Women are sometimes the reward for a male sporting victory. The exception to this is Up and Under, where a female character, as mentioned, Hazel, is the team's trainer, and she later plays with the characters in the final game. Now, historically, rugby league was formed so players would be fairly compensated for their labour, especially in periods of injury. However, the films are suspicious of corporatisation of the game. They contend that rugby league should be played for more honourable reasons than money. You should play with your mates like Footy Legends. You should play with honour in the final winter. You should play as a man in this sporting life or Up and Under. I haven't had a huge chance to dive into this tonight, but Australian rugby league films employ cameos of real-life rugby league personalities, mainly from the footy show. There's a real pipeline from the footy show to rugby league cinema. This is used to enhance the authenticity within the story world, but also adds to the informed audience's experience as they're invited to use their in-depth knowledge of the real rugby league world to create meaning within the film. Finally, real-life professional players have written both British and Australian rugby league films. From quite a small pool, it's remarkable how many of these films were written by former players. We turn our attention to the future. On field, of course, rugby league has several growth areas, primarily in the women's participation and the continued success of national teams from the Pacific Islands. These are obvious areas for rugby league films to also exploit. We've probably had enough tortured white male protagonists. I've included the poster here for Power Mary, which is a feature film documentary about the PNG women's team at the 2017 World Cup. This indicates there's an interest in a market for these stories. I can also foresee films which grapple with concussion and other player health issues as these become more apparent in the future. In fact, there is an Australian television series in my upcoming slides here, which was doing just that. But also view other genres as more exploitable. Why not a rugby league crime thriller or a rom-com? A musical, maybe. I've clipped here a headline for a Darren Aronofsky baseball crime movie with Austin Butler as an example. Just spreading that genre around a bit more. There's certainly enough story potential in this soap opera we call Rugby League for more varied stories. We all love stories about teams and players on the field, so I'm not saying throw it all away, but there's opportunity for more. I've also tackled the creative problem of rugby league cinematic feature in my research by writing my own rugby league film. This is called The Goal Kicker. It's about a schoolgirls team from regional Queensland who make it from the bush to the state finals with the help of a professional rugby league player who, after a scandal, has to find some redemption. He's coaching the girls, but, maybe along the way, they end up teaching him a thing or two as well. I'm not saying that's a groundbreaking new story, but in terms of my research, you probably picked up that in this scenario, the girls represent the future, the coach is indicative of the protagonist of the previous rugby league films. They're trying to prove themselves, he's trying to redeem himself. And a key conflict in this story is the star player, Bianca, who loves football, she's obsessed with it, but her mother can't stand it. She really is against rugby league. So in that sense, I'm trying to grapple with rugby league's place in Australia. It brings people together, it gives people purpose, but it's also got a long way to go in terms of treatment of women, relying on gambling avenue, concussion health issues. In terms of pushing things forward as well, my film hybridizes the wider sports genre and the teen coming of age genre, which we just haven't seen before in a rugby league film. If you're out there want to make some money, want to give me some money to make this, let's make it something happen, hey? As I mentioned on this slide, I've clipped an article about Plum, which is a new ABC series with Brendan Cowell. It's based off of a novel he wrote. It's about a former player struggling with the side effects of concussion in his post-playing career. Comes out next month, and I'll be watching. Hopefully you are too. So a quick detour, and then back to rugby league, then we're done. I haven't covered the topic of genre, but I suspect everyone here has a good knowledge of film genre. They're a way of understanding, grouping, even making and marketing films with common elements. Musicals, romantic comedies, westerns, etc. Audiences over time come to expect certain things from genres, and as writers, you must meet or subvert these expectations. If no one falls in love in your rom-com, questions are raised. Maybe you've got a good reason to destabilize a genre in that way, but you have to explain that somehow. So, if we are to agree that sport is a film genre, not everyone does agree with that, but let's just for now say that there is a sports film genre. The next question is, do individual sports have enough common features to be considered subgenres within that overarching sports genre? Can we say that all basketball movies do this, or baseball movies are obsessed with doing that? Some scholars have done that, and they found those arguments for certain sports. But has anyone thought about rugby league from that perspective? Well, it's nice of you to ask. Is there a rugby league subgenre? That question was driving a lot of my research. Is there something you can say about rugby league? All rugby league films do this. Are there elements, if you're a writer, you're sitting down to write a rugby league film, that you would have to pretty much include? I've come to decide that yes, there is a subgenre of rugby league films, but it's a qualified yes. I say this because most sports films have common elements: underdogs, big game climax, mentor coaches, and so on. So while yes, there are a lot of elements you consider as a writer of a rugby league film, many of these topics, many of these tropes and considerations would be apparent in any sports movie. Another factor, of course, is that there's just not many rugby league films. Been making films for 130 years or so. Rugby league's given us 8. Compare this to the hundreds and hundreds of films about baseball and basketball, boxing, and so on. We're not dealing with the wealth of material for rugby league. But as it stands, if you look at these films closely, these considerations that I've mentioned of class and exploration of tough, violent characters, they do stick out as something specific. So, through my lens of genre and screenwriting, I come to say that a screenwriter who, when writing a rugby league film, fails to consider the interplay of class and the troubled nature of those who are drawn to the game is certainly neglecting the particularities and affordances of the sport. Took me a long time to get to this very simple point, which may be obvious to you already, but I think it's important, probably as important as movies about footy can be. Now, wrapping up, thank you so much for your time. One last plug of me and my little podcast. Get amongst them if you want. As I mentioned, I've had Michael on the I Miss You Man podcast to discuss the final winter. Looking to do some more of those sort of things in the future. Got some plans. We'll see what happens. I hope this has given you an interesting rundown on rugby league and cinema. There's a lot more I haven't covered here. Let's keep this discussion going. Please get in touch. Being a good scholar, here are my references, plus sources throughout. And I thought I'd just give the final word to Gus Gould. Rugby league. What more can you say? Okay, very happy to take some questions now.
Rugby league, indeed. Thank you so much, Lonnie. That was fantastic. We do have a couple of questions come in through chat, and if anyone, after we get through those, wants to call out any more, we're happy to do that as well. The first question, I think Greg Blood and I were on the same page. So I'm going to ask my question and tag Greg's onto the back of it. But when you were talking about the first Kangaroos, you mentioned it as the first and only attempt at a biopic style rugby league film rather than a fictionalized depiction. So my question is, do you think a traditional biopic would have more chance of getting traction? And if so, can you think of any good stories? And Greg has suggested the Super League War or South Sydney being excluded in 1999 as a couple of examples. So could you just speak on that, the biopic concept in general, and some potential stories to tell?
Yeah, certainly. I think the market that we have here in Australia is so small. That is a feature of why these films don't get made that often at all. Just funding is difficult to get. The biopic could be a good angle on that, but I do wonder, do people want to watch a movie for a story they probably know pretty well already? There would have to be some sort of unique selling point. So the Super League War, sort of getting the untold story there could be an interesting one, like the How's That miniseries from a few years ago now. I think the South Sydney story has a lot going for it. You probably already have a bit of a angle with Russell Crowe as well, being involved in that. Not that he was involved in that particularly, but the South Sydney angle to Russell Crowe is important. In terms of other stories, I guess one that springs to mind, and I do remember there was some talk of this happening at one stage. There was an idea for a musical about the start of State of Origin. I think it almost got made up here in Brisbane at one point. That's obviously a very unique tale. So that could be cool as well, something to do with State of Origin. I've always wanted to do something about the 8 straight Queensland dynasty and State of Origin. I'm just not sure what the story would be apart from how cool is this that this happened. Maybe more of a Last Dance documentary for that would be better than a narrative feature film.
No, thank you. But anyway. Jeffrey Gabriel has asked, well, I'll read his question out. The New Zealand creative scene strikes me as one that it's more adventurous or inviting than in Australia. Do you think there could be room for a rugby league story over there, especially given the code's long standing among Maori?
Yeah, certainly. I believe there is the TV drama series, which I didn't look into very much, but it's from New Zealand and it's about rugby union. Hence, I didn't look into it that deeply. But certainly, there's I mentioned the Breaker Upperers in here as a New Zealand film that mentions rugby league. One of the peripheral characters in that film gets a contract with the Gold Coast Titans at one stage and moves on to go play for the Titans as a fun little aside. But I'd certainly be keen to see something from New Zealand because we talk about rugby league, obviously always focused here in Australia on Australia, but it's the national sport in some other parts of the world. It gets played in other parts of the world. It'll be cool to see different stories told.
I think another really cool angle of that is your presentation showed the evolution from stories set in England through to Australia, and with New Zealand in particular, the kind of South Auckland community, that there's an opportunity to open up a new front of rugby league storytelling.
Absolutely. I think in terms of another idea for a film, the Pacific Revolution of the 2017 World Cup could be perhaps a documentary, but certainly something there.
Okay, I'll open up to the floor. If anyone is game, feel free to turn on your audio, your video, and ask a question.
Oh, hi. I just want to thank you for a wonderful talk. It was such an interesting topic, just the whole history of film and rugby league, from the kitchen sink type of that British film of sporting life to, coming to Plum, which I think will be one of the best stories I've ever read. And I'm so excited that it's going to be a show that's showing a story of concussion and poetry. If you've read the book, it's an extraordinary book by Brendan Cowell, and and I guess the story you're working on, there's so many genres you can work on with film. And rugby league can give just the incredible Rocky stories to, the small suburban stories. And when you mentioned New Zealand, when my son was in the East, Harold Matts, there were a lot of Maori kids coming, and I met this particular Maori man who brought kids from his own hometown, from Northland, which was in a very poor part of New Zealand, just trying to stop them killing themselves because suicide was so big, and outlets for sport was just so huge. And he was just doing this incredible favor. Like, he lives here, but he was bringing all these kids from his hometown, and some of them, had some futures, not probably stellar, but they made great and changed their lives. Like, there's a lot of life-changing and wonderful narratives to come out of rugby league. And as you presented in this really good talk, from Arndale's really joyous one, and bleak one of Final Winter to, there's so many stories, and most of them won't work, as you demonstrated, and storytelling is so key to doing it. And I'm currently working on a documentary on Jack Gibson in the 50s and 60s.
Oh, wow.
And I've been on that for about 5 years. We're just rewriting again. But you got to try and get these sort of things right to get a whole feel of stuff. And whatever, and Michael, God bless him, has been wonderful with the library for old photos and things like that, documentaries. And but storytelling, and that's what you're in this talk, is really important. And humanity, especially in Sydney and rugby league, has such a history. 100 years, it's just tied so much into community, and on from the junior level to the big level, they're all hero stories. Like the one you're working on with the team. They're all can be, very profound stories if you get it right, but it's really difficult.
Yeah, that's why I like Footy Legends so much. At the end, where the team's playing, they cut back to the local pub and they're all watching and cheering and stuff. It really does make you smile in that sense. I'm looking forward to Plum as well. Really am, especially because I'll be finished my research and won't have to talk about it. I'll just have to watch it and enjoy it, and not have to critically. I won't help myself critically analyze it, but it'll just be something I can enjoy after this is all done. It's very good timing. And Brendan Cowell, who's in that, also makes a cameo appearance in Broke. He's got one scene that he sort of steals in that movie. So they're all interconnected.
Yeah, well, he wrote Plum, so
yes.
I think it's one of the best stories I've ever read as a book. Not even if it's not even just the rugby league. It's just a really profound story of this guy. It's all tied in, and obviously, and Brendan, as I know, he's a mad Cronulla guy. So it's this whole read the story, you'll really get a feel of just that. I think, and but that's what, as I said, storytelling, wherever it is just so profound.
Cool.
That's the key.
Thank you.
And then they've even managed to make some captivating stories about that funny game they played down in Melbourne. And Greg Bloods asked another great question: did you look at what films being made related to Australian football to see if there are common, different themes? And if you want to extend that and maybe talk about some of the classics of that subgenre.
Yeah, I didn't look too closely at AFL, but I've seen a few of those films over the years. The Club stands out as a classic play and then movie. I don't think you make The Club today. I don't think any real life clubs will be getting themselves name checked like in that movie. There's the Australian Rules. I think it's kind of one of the bleaker ones as well. It's hard to divorce these films that are made in Australia from the Australian film industry context and what gets made down here and what genres and what gets funding and whatnot. Not a huge market in Australia. And I kind of feel like every now and then we try and make a sports movie and think because Australians love sport that will eventually one movie will crack it and it'll become a well-loved sport movie. They don't seem to, though. And there's been lots of cracks over the years. I've watched The Merger, which I really liked, but it didn't get a huge reception. The Backyard Ashes, I liked that one as well, made by the same team, but didn't take the world by storm. I've been told by writers in the industry that sports movies in Australia are cursed. They just can't get made for whatever reason. And I've spoken to this with Michael about why that might be. I think because we watch so much sport in Australia that we don't have that much time for it in a fictional setting. We spend every weekend watching the real sport, and then watching other things as a pastime in the arts. That could be a factor here. So yes, I'd have to do a bit more research on AFL. Hasn't been my area this time around.
I think, could I get you to comment, Lonnie? I don't know if you've looked at this, but you mentioned that we love sport so much that, we don't need fictional films. But what about documentaries? Like, where are the Australian 30 for 30s, given our love of sport and how central it is in our culture?
Yeah, but that's a very good question. I think there'd be a huge market out there for something like that. I imagine in the wake of The Last Dance from a couple of years ago now as well, that there'll be some documentaries looking at that. I have seen some announced and some funding going that way, so it does take a while. I did go to there's a film about the women's Queensland State of Origin team charting their journey and where they got to a couple of years ago. I really liked that. That was really well done. It was on the ABC at one stage. But yeah, I guess it's a matter of funding. I think the NRL, to their credit, have put some funding towards little mini documentaries over the last few years as well, which is interesting and cool. I see some things pop up on KO on the Fox channels as well to do with documentaries. But yeah, I think a lot of these things, the common denominator is that we've just got a small industry, small sporting industry, small film industry. But I think there'd be a market for it. And the work that you do, Michael, with your podcast and the Tom Brock, there's obviously people out there who want to look at sport, not just in the popular way and watching coverage, but also thinking about it critically. And I think there are a lot of people who are maybe want to see a different perspective rather than the perspectives we get from the main TV channels and the main media sources, which is where those more in-depth documentaries come into forth.
Okay, any more questions for Lonnie?
I've only got one more, unless somebody's going to talk. No, I think that, like the Tom Brock lectures, that I sadly missed the last one. I found them to be the most very informative of talking about rugby league in the sense, because it's an academic look at how it affects culture, and everything's just talking about our culture. And rugby league is so immersed in the East Coast, from Queensland all through the bush. I remember the lecture, the Reflections, 2019, and you had a whole host of people talking, particularly Heidi Norman, talking about in Aboriginal bush communities in all these incredible places. There's so many extraordinary tales out there that have been documented by, really, like, the host here as well. So, but what was the other one? The Queensland, the history of the Queensland Rugby League. What's it called? Who was one of the speakers?
Heartland. Joe Gorman's Heartland book.
Yeah, Heartland book. Yeah. They're all, as I said, Australia is such a big place, but rugby league does hold something very special. And look, to get something right in a story like that, because we've seen all of us would attest, we've seen so much epic stuff, as you mentioned in your pre-presentation. Like there's so many elements of rugby league that everyone's just jaw dropped. From kids, when anyone of any age will say, "I saw something incredible that changed," and they can't explain it. And we keep seeing it. Then the game sort of gives. And as you say, there's probably a fatigue to tell a movie story, because we see so many incredible things week in, week out. And that's, as you say, so good luck to anyone but who's trying to make a story, because it's really hard. But I think they need to be told, and it's really important that we make them.
I agree with you, Nick, and I'm very much looking forward to seeing your rugby league story when your Arthur Beeson history finally is finished. Turning away from rugby league, this is one for the film nerds in the audience. But Lonnie, Tobias asks if there are any theories of cinema that you found most relevant to your work. And he says, "I'm struggling to think of anyone except Frederick Jameson. on account of his recent passing. I would love to be pointed to some further reading.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I was thinking back to when I applied to my master's program 4 or 5 years ago now, and I had this big, massive plan. I was going to look at social class and feminism on screen, and a bit of genre and all these other things. And quickly, my supervisors told me, pick one thing and do it well rather than try and do everything, especially in a master's thesis, which is, it's long but not huge. So yeah, I wanted to do everything, and then I thought actually what I could do is do this via genre. And that's why I landed on the genre screenwriting lens for my particular research. I went to a couple authors there. I'll put this in the chat maybe. There's one writer called Jill Selbo. It's a good book about film genre for the screenwriter. But the best book I think that just springs to mind about sport and film is one by a guy called Sean Crossan. This one here. It's amazing. It's a lot of my foundational research was done via that film. It's got a big section on genre. So I really recommend that. In terms of something that I think I wish I could have looked at a bit more, was a sort of a socialist view on sport, and that comes through on screen. So I mentioned in This Sporting Life, which is, kitchen sink drama. It's in that context of British socialist films of the 1950s and 60s, quite bleak, the working class downtrodden and how they can improve things in the post World War II Britain. But this idea that, we think about sport as a fun activity, but to a lot of people, and especially back then, the people being exploited for their labor, and they're literally their bodies are being exploited for other people's labor, which is something a lot of these films, dive into in various ways. So especially those films which are, situating rugby league as working class people, he goes from exploiting his body in the coal mines to exploiting his body on the sporting pitch. I didn't have enough time in my master's particularly to dive into that subject, but it did really strike me and opened up some different ways of thinking about rugby league. And then again, the corporatization of the game, which some of these films rally against. Can't go back. It's already there. But we think about not just the Brisbane Broncos going to play a game on the weekend, but the Brisbane Broncos with this betting company on their shoulder, this other company on the back of their shorts. What are they advertising? How many times can you watch a sporting game with advertising being thrown at you? That's another angle I think is quite interesting, and something that I think a film could, feature film could really look into deeply in a sort of context of that.
Okay, we might end it there. So I just want to say thank you so much, Lonnie. This was a really fascinating presentation, and really looking forward to seeing the final product of your research. But yeah, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Well, thanks for having me. Anytime, we'll come back.
Thank you.
Okay, so yeah, thanks, Lonnie, and thanks everyone for attending.
Thanks, Michael.